Chapter 12 is entitled The Birth of Biblical Criticism, and this is the final chapter of Volume 1. Jonathan Eibeschutz's first heretical crypto-Sabbatean theological seminary was in Prague. When Rabbi Hagetz urged a ban on registration of yeshiva students at Eibeschutz's yeshiva, Chagetz was under the impression that its registrants were good, God-fearing Jewish young men who aspired to the independent study of the Torah and Talmudic texts. In reality, they were hand-picked students who had been recommended to the yeshiva by two-faced crypto-Sabbatean religious instructors who were dedicated and indoctrinated in Sabbateanism. They spread themselves over the face of Eastern Europe, posing as legitimate teachers of Judaism, but earned side income through subsidies of wealthy Sabbatians. They sought out at all times students whom they could take into their confidence, who had a flair for Kabbalah and who were good schemers, extremely brilliant, as well as those students who were being raised as Sabbatians or crypto-Sabbatians by their parents. Once having located the right candidate, they would tutor him privately and secretly in the mystical teachings of the movement. The network of Sabbatians was held together by an elaborate system of communications consisting of couriers and emissaries whose full-time job it was to run messages all over Eastern Europe. Across this network traveled much information and secret messages, some of which have been lying around in archives in Europe. It reached the archives because from time to time various governments who were monitoring Sabbatian activity in Europe were able to intercept and confiscate their communications. An interesting letter confiscated from the Sabbatian prophet Judah Leib Prosnitz, 1690 to 1730, en route to Jonathan Eibeschutz, sheds light on these activities. Prosnitz is condemned at the beginning of Rabbi Chagetz's letter urging a ban on Eibeschutz's yeshiva. Chagetz described Prosnitz as the abominable Leib of Prosnitz. Prosnitz prophesied that Jonathan Eibeschutz would be the Messiah to follow Shabbatai Zvi. When Eibeschutz's Prague seminary was in full swing, his crypto-Sabbatian fledglings were already scheming as to how they could destroy and discredit the legitimate rabbinate, yeshiva system, and communal structure of the teeming city of Prague. The chief rabbi of the Prague community at the time was a most prominent and saintly man, Rabbi David Oppenheim, 1664 to 1736. Rabbi Oppenheim had his own yeshiva where students from Jewish communities throughout Europe would come to engage in advanced Talmudic studies. Around 1720, Eibeschutz's students, who supposedly were good yeshiva students, did something very out of character with their tenor of what the yeshiva world had been and had exemplified for thousands of years. They vandalized Rabbi Oppenheim's yeshiva, assaulting some students and inflicting severe bodily injury and harm upon these students. They entered the yeshiva's main study hall where students were reviewing their daily Talmudic assignments, and they completely demolished it. As a result of this incident, Rabbi Oppenheim's students began to realize the real nature of Eibeschutz's yeshiva. In the months that followed, Rabbi Oppenheim's students were ambushed and periodically beaten by Eibeschutz's thugs who haunted the alleyways of the city in Prague. By this time, Rabbi Oppenheim's students were engaged in escalating their retaliation, and although details of how they fought back have not survived, it is very possible that some of Eibeschutz's students were systematically killed, because on June 16, 1772, Charles VI of Austria issued an edict to end the feud. This background information is important because it comes from the same environment in which Karl Anton emerged. He was a star pupil of Eibeschutz's yeshiva, and after graduating from the yeshiva, Anton converted to Christianity. He was a Frankist and occupied a chair as professor of Hebrew at Heimstedt. Eibeschutz's disciplines had definitive objectives assigned to them so that they would play certain roles in the revolution. Karl Anton's assignment was to discredit the Bible. In order to best accomplish this, no obstacle would stand in his way, such as his religion. Therefore, Anton officially converted to Christianity so that he could hold an esteemed professional chair. Anton's function was so sensitive and scandalous that painstaking efforts were made to obscure his activities. This is why reference to his life cannot be found in the Encyclopedia Judaica, nor in the older Jewish encyclopedia. To effectuate his plan, Anton devised a game plan to discredit the Bible in a masterly blueprint that would take about a century to develop. The plan went into effect as scheduled, and its essential features were implemented over a period taking nearly twice as long, for Anton could not anticipate future setbacks in the Illuminati timetable. Anton's blueprint is as follows, and there are 8 steps. Number 1, develop a close circle of intellectuals whose main objective would be to destroy the Bible. Number 2, these intellectuals should be mainly academics who should occupy chairs at leading universities, but other intellectuals would supplement their work. Number 3, this intellectual group should attempt to pull itself into positions where it could control the dissemination of information vital to biblical studies. This means they should gravitate to positions of authority in scholastic publications dealing with these fields, including libraries and archives. Number 4, all sections of the Illuminati, Frankists, and fellow revolutionaries of future generations must cooperate fully to promote and enhance the career advancement of the Biblical Destruction Group, BDG, and should apply pressure where necessary towards that advancement. Number 5, BDG must be self-perpetuating. Every member must produce at least one replacement for himself in his lifetime. Number 6, all media at the disposal of revolutionaries must be rallied to disseminate propaganda issued by any member of the BDG. Number 7, people who are not members of the BDG, but who seem to show an interest in pursuing anti-Bible thought, should be encouraged without even their knowledge and catapulted to important positions. This will strengthen the BDG at any time in history. And number 8, as time goes on, those who accept the views that are fostered by the BDG should be in a position strong enough to destroy any academician or intellectual who does not conform to these ideas. Anton then proceeded to work his plan. His plan succeeded in the following events and is, in fact, still in process today. So in 1782, Moses Dobruschka, now Moses Schoenfeld, was appointed director of the Vienna Library Archives. The Jacobin Zelkind Auerwitz, 1740 to 1812, was appointed secretary and interpreter of Oriental languages at the Royal Library, Paris, France, in 1789. Ferdinand Hitzig, 1807 to 1875, a descendant of the Hitzig banking family in Berlin, embarked on a career as a biblical scholar. French physician Jean Struck, 1685 to 1766, served the court of Augustus II of Poland in 1730, and he made an initial contact with the Sabbatians. In 1753, Struck's first biblical work appeared, 1 year after Karl Anton wrote an apology in defense of Rabbi Jonathan Eibeshütz. It postulated what is known as the first documentary hypothesis, that the Pentateuch was a compilation of separate documents written centuries apart. And finally, Jena and Göttingen universities in Germany became centers of anti-biblical rhetoric. Karl Anton did not hesitate to cross religious lines when Jonathan Eibeshütz was again attacked for heretical Sabbatianism by Jacob Enden in 1750. In 1752, he wrote a defense for Eibeshütz, and Dr. Moshe Perlmutter, a disciple of Gershom Scholem, states that when Karl Anton wrote his defense of Eibeshütz, Eibeshütz supplied him with textual material which he utilized. In his defense of Jonathan Eibeshütz, Anton virulently attacked Judaism and the rabbis, accusing them of applying the golden rule, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself," Leviticus 19:18, only to the Jews and not to Christians, as Rabbi Jonathan Eibeshütz does. To further his deception, Jonathan Eibeshütz, meanwhile, was constantly attacking the Sabbatians. When he was a rabbi in Prague, he went so far as to publicly pronounce a ban of excommunication against them. And when the yeshiva violence took place, Eibeshütz played dumb. He couldn't understand why good yeshiva students could fight other students of Rabbi Oppenheim. And so the fights continued amongst the yeshiva without subsiding until the imperial edict. Among the more dangerous and famous biblical critics we can list is Johann David Michaelis, 1717 to 1791. Michaelis was very active as a writer, theologian, Orientalist, and biblical critic. His main publishing activity was that of editor of the Biblical Exegesis Journal of the day. He denigrated Jews. Initially, he gave Mendelssohn good reviews, but argued with him extensively later on. It is possible that his arguments with Mendelssohn were merely conspiratorial in character and were meant to serve as excuses for Mendelssohn to become famous as a great spokesman for Jewish emancipation. Because while Michaelis made public remarks of an anti-Semitic nature, Mendelssohn considered Michaelis to be an ally when it came to scripture from an aspect of non-dogmatic exegesis. An interesting example of where Mendelssohn and Michaelis locked horns was when Michaelis tried to prove statistically that Jews were 25 times as corrupt as Germans with respect to thievery. Mendelssohn's reply had been summarized by Antleman as follows. If a nation's depravity was to be assessed, he declared, it was necessary to take into account murderers, highwaymen, traitors, arsonists, adulterers, harlots, infanticidists, etc., not thieves alone. But even under the erroneous assumption that only thieves and dealers in stolen goods were an index of a nation's depravity, Michaelis' statistical methods were wrong. The number of Jews in the category was not to be compared with general population figures, but with non-Jews of the same description among small traders and second-hand dealers. A comparison would then show that there were 25 times more Germans than Jewish offenders of this kind. He added grimly, besides, the Jews resort to such a way of life from sheer necessity, while the non-Jew has a chance to become a field marshal or a cabinet minister, and by his free choice become a small trader, a second-hand dealer, a mousetrap vendor, a magic lantern, or a curiosities huckster. End quote. Michaelis wrote several volumes of works that were devoted to biblical criticism, such as his work entitled The New Testament, which appears in 1750. Michaelis also suggested to the King of Denmark that an archaeological excavation should be carried out in the Near East. This is one of the earliest references that one can find to an excavation of this type. It is indeed unfortunate that some of the great archaeological discoveries of the 19th century were interpreted and reported to the media from the standpoint of disproving the Bible or undermining it. After Mendelssohn's death, a certain Judah ben Zayev, 1764 to 1811, of Jewish birth, moved to Berlin in 1787 and secured for himself the dubious distinction of the first Jewish scholar to apply Western research methods to the study of Hebrew. Ben Zayev's heresies traveled to his native city of Krakow, so that when he returned later on, the rabbis of the community forced him to leave, and he later settled in Vienna. Following on the heels of Johann David Michaelis for leadership in the field of biblical criticism came J.G. Eichhorn, 1752 to 1827. He presided as professor of Oriental Studies at Jena, 1775 to 1787. It is interesting to note that while Karl Marx studied at Bonn and Berlin, he received his Ph.D. from the same university, Jena. Eichhorn left Jena to join the faculty of philosophy at Göttingen, which position he held from 1788 until the time of his death. It is claimed that he had an influence on Moses Mendelssohn. G. Herder, who was his colleague, was a known member of the Illuminati. Following Eichhorn came Wilhelm de Wet, 1780 to 1849. De Wet's Ph.D. dissertation in 1805 at Jena University was known as the Discourse of Deuteronomy. De Wet's discourse was embodied at a later date by another biblical critic named Welhausen. De Wet's main thesis was that the entire book of Deuteronomy was written around the time of King Hosea. If this thesis would have had the proper critical exposure that it deserved in the media, it would have been pulled down as just plain absurd. One must remember that the Illuminati and the Jacobins were seizing on anything they could to break the authority of the Bible, in the same manner as their disciples seized later on Darwin's Origin of Species as a means to undermine the Bible, in spite of the fact that Darwin himself believed that God created man, which appears to be lost in the shuffle somewhere, as well as the fact that it is possible to interpret Scripture even according to Darwin. Science today has discredited and outdated much of what Darwin has written anyway. De Wet overlooks some basic facts that would stare in the face anyone who is intimately familiar with the manner and tenor of the Hebrew Bible. What is significant here is that the biblical account tells that a manuscript of the Torah was found in Josiah's time in the temple of Chilkiyahu, the high priest. And when the Bible tells us that it was found, it is most significant that the Bible does not tell us that it was written by Chilkiyahu. Scripture tells us furthermore that it was given to Shaphan, the scribe, for reading, who in turn brought it to the king. This narrative and this fact shed some very important light on the true function of the royal priestly scribe. The scribes were guardians of the Torah, and they knew the Torah by heart in all its innuendos, and preserved what is known as the authentic Masoretic text. It is significant that the Bible, on the spot, tells us that Shaphan's grandfather was none other than Meshullam the scribe. The reason is that the information is vital and critical to a proper understanding of the narrative and tells us why Shaphan was competent to render judgment as to the authenticity of the found manuscript. Preceding Josiah's reign on the throne was the chaotic period of Manasseh, King Josiah's grandfather, persecutor of the faithful, who burned manuscripts of the Torah. Shaphan came from a scribal dynasty. His grandfather, in turn, a scribe, is the Hebrew Bible's best example of a chain of tradition from father to son, mitigating against a physical destruction of Torah manuscripts. Indeed, biblical critics are hard-pressed to explain the importance of the pedigree of priestly families and their scribal functions. For example, Shemaiah ben Nathaniel kept records for King David concerning the priestly families, and every king had such records kept. Shaphan was not only the descendant of a priestly family, but his descendants in turn carried on the tradition. For example, when Josiah's son Jehoiakim ruled over Judah, Shaphan's son Gemariah served as scribe. On one occasion, Jeremiah's disciple Baruch ben Neriah recited a prophetic message stating, "The chamber of Gemariah, the son of Shaphan the scribe in the upper court." And when Micaiah, the son of Jenariah, the son of Shaphan, had heard the words of the Lord, he went into the king's house, into the scribe's chamber, and all the princes sat there, even Elishama the scribe. Elishama and his clerks were named after their scribal ancestors, who are explicitly mentioned as having lived in the days of Jehoshaphat, and they taught in Judah, having the book of God's Torah with them. The scribal dynasty produced none other than Ezra, the scribe, who resurrected the Torah in his day, and who himself was a descendant of Meshullam, or Shulam, in abbreviated Hebrew, and from the stock of Aaron, the high priest. If he had taken the narrative of chapter 22 of Kings II as authentic, then he would certainly have had to take chapter 14 of Kings II as equally authentic. Chapter 14 records an incident which took place several generations before Josiah was born, when Amaziah, king of Judah, killed the people who deposed his father from the throne, but did not kill their children because, as it is written in the Torah of Moses, fathers should not be killed on account of their children, nor children on account of their fathers, but each shall perish on account of his own sin. The verse referred to in Kings II appears in the Torah in the book of Deuteronomy, where it states, "Fathers should not be killed on account of their children, or children on account of their sins of their fathers. Every man shall be put to death for his own sin." If, according to DeWitt, the book of Deuteronomy was composed in the time of Josiah, then how is it possible that a verse that was referred to from the book of Deuteronomy appeared generations before Josiah was born? There are also other analogous verses from the Bible cited from Deuteronomy that chronologically preceded Josiah's reign, including Joshua chapter 8 verse 31 and chapter 23 verse 6, and the 1 Kings chapter 2 verse 3. DeWitt joined the Faculty of Theology in Berlin, but even they could not tolerate his views, and he was dismissed in 1819 for liberal views. He was appointed as professor of antiquities and theology in Basel in 1822, after a short stay in Weimar. After DeWitt, we find that the 19th century biblical criticism was finally dominated by Julius Welhausen, 1844 to 1918, who was born a Lutheran and was professor of Oriental Studies at Halle from 1882 to 1885, and became professor ordinaris of theology in Greifswald, a position which he resigned in 1882 and transferred to Göttingen in 1892. Welhausen became famous for what was known as the Welhausen Hypothesis, which attributed the authorship of the Pentateuch to 4 authors, J, E, D, and P, D standing for the Deuteronomy Code. More formally, the hypothesis became known as the Second Documentary Hypothesis, and D, the author of Deuteronomy, was an element that was borrowed from DeWitt's thesis. This theory has never been scientifically proven. On the contrary, it has been discredited many times in the past by competent biblical scholars. Despite this, it still holds on because radicals and their fellow travelers have decided that it should be deemed valid. Moritz Steinschneider, 1816 to 1907, was born in the town of Prosnitz, Moravia, to a Sabatian family. His father Jacob, 1782 to 1856, was active in the Prague circle of Sabatians. The Sabatian prophet from that locale, Judah Lieb Prosnitz, had an able disciple in Moritz. Steinschneider attended the Christian school in his community as well as the yeshiva and was ordained as a rabbi. He was considered to be one of the pioneers of the so-called Jewish science, which was advocated by Abraham Geiger. In 1833, Steinschneider moved to the Sabatian center of Prague. He engaged in biblical criticism and spent much of his time in the field of Jewish bibliography. His close disciples included Solomon Schrechter and Judah Magnus, whom we will discuss in detail in Volume 2. From Gershom Scholem, we learn that Gotthold Wiehl, one of Steinschneider's last students, upon visiting the aged Steinschneider in his library towards the end of his life, which was devoted for 70 years to researching Jewish bibliography, literature, and culture, Wiehl, who had been freshly inspired by the Jewish Students' League, gushed forth before him the ideas of the Jewish Renaissance and reconstruction of Judaism as a living entity, but Steinschneider regarded this as nonsense. Pointing towards his bookcase, he said, "We have only one task left, to give the remains of Judaism a decent burial." Steinschneider was a student activist and founded a secret society called Unity, which lasted from 1836 to 1842. The society supposedly was billed as a Zionist group, founded in Prague, which would be active in getting Jews out of Austria to the Holy Land. However, the Austrian police thought otherwise. They concluded that the Unity Group was a secret society with destructive and reformist tendencies, and that Steinschneider, as its founder, was a dangerous person. Because of this, Metternich personally inquired to the Berlin police, who whitewashed the group. The credibility of Steinschneider as a Zionist seems to be lost when it is known both from Scholem and others that he was an anti-Zionist, so much so that he stated that Zionism is more dangerous than anti-Semitism. In 1847, Moritz applied as the director of the Israel Jacobson School, named after its Bundist founder, but he was refused. However, on March 8, 1848, Steinschneider was found on the streets of Berlin building barricades to aid the Communist Revolution of 1848. It is interesting to note that on one occasion, Steinschneider committed the unforgivable sin for which the Communist Reform and Conservative clergy never forgave him. It is important in carrying out their work that no trace of certain relationships be left for future generations. Steinschneider broke security on one occasion, which caused the breakup of his 40-year friendship with Dr. Meyer Kayserling, who, before Altmann's Mendelssohn, was considered to have written the most comprehensive biography on Mendelssohn. Kayserling published a biography extolling Ludwig Philippson, 1811 to 1889, who was founder of the first Jewish weekly in German, and also author of a German translation of the Bible. Philippson was a Bund political activist with reform sympathies. In a review, Steinschneider sinned by revealing that Kayserling was Philippson's son-in-law. It should be noted that Philippson was the prime mover in opening up Geiger's Berlin Seminary in 1872. Steinschneider perpetuated the tradition of biblical criticism started by Anton through his students, such as Schrechter. This was true of all members of the biblical conspiracy. For example, Max Lilienthal scouted out Daniel Schwolson, 1819 to 1911, in Riga when they were there doing dirty work for the Bund. Lilienthal sent him to Abraham Geiger because ch.12 had a good rabbinical background. Geiger trained his student well and initiated him for further work in the field of biblical criticism, and like Karl Anton, it was necessary for ch.12 to fulfill his mission by converting to Christianity so that he could get a professorship. So in 1855, ch.12 accepted Greek Orthodoxy and a university professorship as a chairman of the Department of Oriental Studies at the University of St. Petersburg in Russia. It was there that ch.12 continued his work in the field of biblical blasphemy. However, he started to rebel against the conspiracy and quit the Hebrew Enlightenment Society of St. Petersburg, known as the Chever Mefitza HaHaskalah. From that day on, he became a staunch defender of rabbinical Judaism and utilized his university professorship to defend yeshiva, Talmudic publications, and the Jews of Russia against blood libels. An interesting study in contrasts between a committed biblical critic who was politically indoctrinated and one who was attracted to Jewish studies and adopted the blasphemies of the biblical critics because he was logically convinced of their merit is provided by studying the lives of Ephraim Speiser, 1902 to 1965, and Yechezkel Kaufman, 1889 to 1963. Ephraim Speiser was born in Galicia and came to the United States in 1920. Kaufman was born in Poland, but instead of settling in the United States, he was Zionistically inclined and settled in Israel in 1928. Speiser was on the editorial committee of the Anchor Bible, and in 1964 he produced the Genesis edition. It is full of blasphemy like the rest of the Anchor Bible, and Speiser makes reference to Welhausian authorship in his book by putting capital letters and parentheses after biblical verses, designating who wrote them. Kaufman, while subscribing to Welhausen's hypothesis, wrote his monumental work, an 8-volume treatise in Hebrew entitled Toldat Hayamuna Hayasroilit, 7 volumes of which were translated from the Hebrew in 1960 under the title The Religion of Israel. Kaufman is original because, unlike the other critics who claim that Judaism and the Bible evolved from paganism, he takes painstaking care to show that Judaism is not a development from paganism, but has an entire new beginning in itself. He writes strictly against Greek secularism and stresses the importance of the Jewish religion, but unfortunately he is still caught in the trappings of biblical critics and points out apparent contradictions in the Torah, which any good Talmudic scholar can easily refute. Of the biblical critics mentioned, Speiser, Kaufman, and Snyder were embraced by the conservative movement. The conservative movement's outstanding spokesman, Solomon Schechter, in order to try to curry favor with religious Jews, referred to Welhausen and the German biblical critics and their criticisms not as higher biblical criticism, but as higher anti-Semitism. Yet he agreed with the idea that God did not write the Torah. The documentary hypothesis was successfully refuted by the following biblical scholars who wrote classical works. They include J. Robertson, The Early Religion of Israel, James Orr, who wrote The Problem of the Old Testament, W. L. Baxter, 1841 to 1937, who wrote Sanctuary and Sacrifice, H. M. Weiner, 1874 to 1929, who wrote Essays in Pentateuchal Criticism, D. Hoffman, 1843 to 1921, wrote Die Stegen and Stanzen gegen die Welhausen Hypothesis, and more recently, Elihu Schatz, Proofs of the Accuracy of the Bible, Jonathan David, 1973. In addition to these books, one of the great Orientalists, A. H. Sayce, 1845 to 1933, lectured widely against the entire concept of the hypothesis. Nevertheless, as was pointed out before, faculties throughout the world who deal with biblical literature and Oriental studies have chosen to ignore the works of these people, and so the accumulated blasphemies as to the integrity of the Hebrew Bible persist. Epilogue. In this volume, we have shown how a conspiracy developed to undermine Judaism and how it engulfed an entire continent and spread throughout the Western world. It has been noted that the modern period did not spontaneously begin. A famous academic anecdote tells the story of a student who raised his hand to ask his professor when the Renaissance began. The professor explained that on December 31st, 1399, a party was held in Italy, and they proclaimed that at midnight the Renaissance would begin. One cannot precisely put one's finger on the time nor the place when a conspiracy began to undermine all the religions of the world, and Judaism in particular. One can point to specific events that took place, so that communism was not born when Adam Weishaupt founded the Illuminati on May Day, 1776. Certain changes were already in evidence when Mendelssohn came onto the scene in the Jewish communities of Europe. In the time of Shabbatai Zvi, the false Messiah, the Jewish community of the world acted as one body. By the time Moses Mendelssohn came onto the scene, polarization had begun to appear. The Frankists and Bund members contributed to the further polarization of the Jewish people, which is going on up to this very day. Only the State of Israel has acted as a unifying force. When the rabbis prophetically saw the Holocaust in Mendelssohn's Berlin Circle, they were also looking at one essential consequence of this, that the alienation which Mendelssohn began would eventually result not only in the desecration of Judaism, but would destroy the eventual hope of Israel returning to its homeland. Indeed, the prophets of Israel declared long ago that a Holocaust would come to those Jews who did not return to their homeland when they had the opportunity to do so. Thus did God warn Israel that a slaughter would befall those who forsook Zion, that's Isaiah 65, 11 and 12, while those who would return and inhabit Zion would be spared. Implicit to the development of Frankist revolutionaries and the Bund philosophy was a hatred for Zionism. A return to Israel by a pure Zionism, which is based on basic Jewish religious concepts, further developed and appeared to be successful. At this point, the conspirators undermined Judaism by attempting to radicalize Zionism. Unfortunately, the radical side of Zionism has won out in terms of the socialist Histadrut party that has dominated the State of Israel to this very day. A conspiracy thus exists and is perpetuated where a group of wealthy Neoplatonists attempt to dominate Israel with huge sums of money and try to maintain their control over its future. They have succeeded in stabilizing the development of the state so that Israel would be perpetually dependent on them for its economic growth. There is no reason why Israel's present 30 billion Israeli lira, or $8 billion American roughly, economy is not 100 billion. Israeli bureaucracy, spawned by socialism, has given birth to a disgraceful, stultifying status quo which permeates the government, manifested by a suchabet, or red tape, which saps the very lifeblood of the state. Our description of the Illuminati is based on John Robison's Proofs of a Conspiracy. The question, of course, should be asked, how reliable was Robison? Robison was a great scientist. He was a professor of chemistry on the faculty of Edinburgh University in Scotland. What is even more impressive is that George Washington acknowledged the threat of the Illuminati, and in a letter dated September 25th, 1798, he wrote the following letter to a Reverend G. W. Snyder. Sir, many apologies are due to you for my not acknowledging the receipt of your obliging favor on the 22nd, also, and for not thanking you at an earlier period for the book that you had the goodness to send me. I have heard much of the nefarious and dangerous plan and doctrines of the Illuminati, but never saw the book until you were pleased to send it to me. The same causes for which have prevented my acknowledging the receipt of your letter have prevented me from reading the book, hitherto, namely, the multiplicity of matters which pressed upon me before, and the debilitated state in which I had left after a severe fever had been removed, and which allows me to add little more now than the thanks for your kind wishes and favorable sentiments, except to correct an error which you have run into of my presiding over the English lodges in this country. The fact is, I preside over none, nor have I ever been in one more than once or twice within the last 30 years. I believe, notwithstanding, that none of the lodges in this country are contaminated with the principles ascribed to the Society of the Illuminati. And with respect, George Washington. Just as Washington realized that there was a conspiracy to undermine the United States in his day, so too a similar conspiracy is being carried out in the state of Israel in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War. The same radical clique that gave the world socialism and communism wants to see the Jewish religion and its people destroyed. In their ranks are those of Jewish origin. They did everything they could before the State of Israel was established to try and prevent it from becoming a reality. But once it became a reality, they sought to control it. As, for example, at the outbreak of the Yom Kippur War, the Histadrut Secretary General Ben Aaron, an avowed Marxist, controlled the affairs of Israel's majority party. He was advised to resign thereafter because of his extreme Marxist views, which people thought were not in the best interests of the State of Israel. He has been succeeded by General Secretary Marshall, who was not a militant Marxist. Future chapters of the next volume, God willing, will trace the beginnings of the Zionist movement in opposition to the Frankist elite, and will also discuss how the conservative movement began. We shall discuss the early beginnings of Nazism as a social party in 1893 called the Anti-Semitic Party, as well as certain aspects of the Holocaust. We shall also show how certain Jews in the Civil Rights Movement and the Reform and Conservative movements in the United States plotted with black radicals to destroy manifestations of Jewish life in the United States from 1964 to the present time, with particular attention to Boston, where the author witnessed the forced exile of 60,000 Jews because of assaults, robberies, rapes, and the murder of over 250 Jews from 1968 to 1973. It goes without saying that one cannot be a Jew and a communist, for in accepting the tenets of the accursed Karl Marx, one turns his back not only on the Torah, but on the universal morality of Judaism preached by the Noahide laws. For a Jew certainly cannot become a Christian and still be a Jew. One who does is called a meshumad, a renegade from his faith. If he became a Christian, he can certainly be a civilized human being, of course. However, if you turn your back on basic morality, then one is a barbarian and is no longer a civilized human being. Being a civilized human being is a prerequisite for being a Jew, and it goes without saying that a barbarian cannot be a rabbi. Therefore, we shall devote a section to discuss how real rabbis fought back the scourge of antinomian nihilistic socialism and communism, and fought barbarians who masqueraded as rabbis.